Okay, so you shared this really interesting academic article with us. It's called Ministerial Advisors as Power Resources, Exploring Expansion, Stability, and Contraction in Westminster Ministers' Offices. Bit of a mouthful.
It is, yeah. By Pickering, Kraft, and Brands from 2023.
Right. And what we want to do in this deep dive is basically cut through the academic jargon and get straight to the point.
Yeah.
What does this research actually tell us about government power?
Exactly. How it's maybe been changing in places like Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, the sort of classic Westminster systems.
And they do it in a pretty clever way, focusing on ministerial advisors.
Yeah.
Not always the first thing people think about when they talk about power.
No, it's not. But the article kicks off with this fundamental point. We often hear that the executive, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, they've just been getting stronger and stronger, more powerful over time.
Yeah, that's the common narrative, isn't it?
It is. But the authors immediately hit a problem. Okay, how do you actually measure that? How do you prove executive power has really grown?
Right. It's kind of abstract. And they list, what, 3 main issues?
Yeah, 3 big hurdles. First, what are the concrete things, the empirical indicators we should even be looking for? It's not obvious.
Okay.
Second, comparing across different countries, even these fairly similar ones, and tracking changes over time within them. That's really tough. Different systems, different contexts.
And the third point.
The third is just acknowledging that power isn't, a one-way street. It doesn't only go up. It could increase, yeah, but it might also just stay the same or even shrink depending on what's happening politically.
So measuring it directly is a nightmare.
Pretty much. So the authors thought, okay, what can we measure that gives us a good proxy, a reliable hint about these power dynamics?
And that's where the advisors come in.
Exactly. Their big idea is to use the number of ministerial advisors as a key indicator. They argue the size of a minister's team, their office, represents a crucial power resource.
Makes sense. More hands on deck. So the core question for this deep dive, drawing from the article, is really, when do these ministerial offices measured by advisor numbers actually grow? When do they stay stable, and when do they shrink?
Yeah, across different governments, different times in these 4 countries.
And it definitely seems like it's pushing back on that simple idea that power, or at least this resource, is just always expanding.
It really does. Now, maybe we should quickly clarify who these advisors actually are.
Good point. They're not just regular civil servants.
No, the article defines them pretty clearly. They're temporary and they're partisan, politically aligned with the government.
Ah, so they come and go with the government.
Right. And crucially, they're exempt from the usual impartiality rules that bind the permanent bureaucracy. Their job is explicitly political advice.
Got it. And the research looks at them in sort of 2 ways, numbers versus roles.
Yeah, it mentions quantitative, the numbers, and qualitative, what they actually do. But, getting reliable data on the day-to-day roles across countries and time is even harder.
So we're focusing, like the article mostly does, on the numbers, the quantitative side.
Exactly, because that's where they could build these data sets. The core argument is that having more advisors potentially means more influence.
How so?
Well, think about it. More advisors could mean more capacity to, say, manage the media, shape policy development, deal with the permanent officials, handle things in Parliament. It's about bandwidth, essentially, amplifying the minister's reach.
Okay, I see the logic. So the data. How on earth did they pull together numbers for 4 countries over, 20-plus years?
Yeah, 1997 to 2020. It was clearly a massive effort. They built 4 new data sets covering 21 different governments across that period.
Wow.
And they looked at 2 main things: the Prime Minister's office, the PMO, and then all the other ministers' offices, the MOs.
And just counting heads could be misleading, right? Like adding one advisor to a tiny office is different from adding one to a huge one.
Yeah.
How do they define growth or shrinkage?
Good question. They set specific percentage thresholds. For the PMO, an increase of over 5% counted as expansion. Staying within plus or minus 5% was stability, and dropping more than 5% was contraction.
Okay, 5% for the PMO.
But for the other ministers' offices, the MOs, they used wider bands. Over 10% for expansion, within plus minus 10% for stability, and over 10% decrease for contraction.
Why the difference? 10% versus 5%?
Well, the thinking was partly about scale. PMOs are often smaller, so a smaller percentage change might still be significant. Also, maybe trying to capture more deliberate changes in the MOs, rather than just minor fluctuations, and acknowledging potential data noise across many departments.
Right, trying to filter out the bumps and focus on real shifts. Did they mention any gaps or limitations in the data they managed to get?
Oh yeah, they're upfront about it. Sometimes the data couldn't easily separate advisors for different parties in a coalition, for example.
Okay.
And tracking changes for specific ministries, especially right after a cabinet shuffle, was tricky. Plus, for New Zealand, the really early numerical data was scarce, so they had to lean on expert judgments for some of that period before 2013.
So where did it all come from? Freedom of information request,
Yeah.
government reports?
A mix, really. For Australia, things like Senate estimates reports and building on previous academic work.
Okay.
Britain, they used official cabinet office reports and, again, earlier research. Canada was a formal request to the government.
Right.
And New Zealand, the later data came from direct contact with the Department of Internal Affairs, plus that expert knowledge for the earlier years. It shows how piecemeal this kind of comparative work can be.
Definitely. Okay, so they've got the data, the definitions. What did they actually find? Did the numbers just go up and up?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. No, not just up and up. That's the key finding, really.
Okay.
They found, yes, plenty of expansion in both PMOs and MOs,
Yeah.
but also a lot of stability. And significantly, quite a few instances of contraction, especially in the MOs.
So shrinking offices.
Yeah. For the PMOs, it was roughly equal parts expansion and stability, with contraction being pretty rare. But for the MOs, while expansion and stability were common, contraction was definitely noticeable too.
So that idea of just constant, relentless growth at the center of government.
It's too simple. This research really adds nuance to that picture. It shows periods of consolidation, even reduction.
Did they see different patterns in the different countries?
Yes, there were variations. Australia, for instance, had early growth, especially under Howard, then a drop in MOs under Red Gillard, then increases again, and more recently, a trend towards stability.
Right.
Canada was more up and down, kind of volatile, though MO numbers have generally trended upwards since around 2008.
And Britain?
Britain started smaller, but had 3 distinct waves of expansion.
Yeah.
New Zealand, on the other hand, showed the least change overall, mostly stability.
So quite different national stories. What about the overall percentage change across the whole period? Like how much bigger did things get overall?
They crunched those numbers too. The UK Prime Minister's office saw the biggest percentage jump more than doubled.
Wow.
The Australian PMO grew a lot too, about 78%. Canada's PMO was more modest, around 23%. New Zealand's PMO stayed pretty flat.
And the other ministers' offices? The MOs.
Canada actually saw the biggest percentage increase there. Australia and Britain had similar, smaller growth rates in MO advisors. And New Zealand, again, very little change in MO staffing overall.
So it's a really varied picture across countries and between the PMO and the rest of the ministers. Definitely not uniform.
Yeah, not at all. Which leads to the next part of the analysis. Why? Why these different patterns?
Right. They tried to link the changes to political factors.
Exactly. They looked at 4 main things. The political leaning of the governing party, how long the government had been in office, whether it had a majority in parliament, and leadership stability.
Okay, let's break those down. First, party politics, left versus right. Did that make a difference?
It did, but maybe not how you'd expect. They actually found a slight tendency, a marginal bias, they call it, for right-leaning governments to be associated with expanding advisor numbers, both in the PMO and MOs.
Really? Not left parties trying to drive change.
Well, counterintuitively, left parties actually accounted for more instances of contraction than right parties did.
Huh. That goes against the grain a bit.
It does. It challenges that assumption that left parties would automatically lean more heavily on partisan advisors.
Interesting. Okay, second factor. Government tenure. New governments versus established ones.
Right. Here, the findings suggested that incoming prime ministers, those just starting out, were more likely to expand their personal team, the PMO.
That makes sense. Bringing in your own people.
Yeah, building that core group. But what was also interesting is that quite a few incumbent PMs also expanded their PMOs. So it wasn't just a first-term thing. The need for that central support might persist or even grow.
Okay. What about the other ministers' offices, the MOs? Did tenure matter there?
Less clear patterns there, actually. Whether a government was incoming or incumbent didn't seem to consistently predict expansion or contraction in the wider ministerial offices. The exception was that Australian example where the incoming Rudd government made a specific promise to cut staff.
So more complexity. Third factor. Parliamentary control. Majority versus minority or coalition governments.
This one showed some strong results. Prime ministers leading non-majority governments, So minority or coalition situations were significantly more likely to expand their PMOs.
Ah, needing more central control and negotiation muscle, maybe.
That seems the likely interpretation. More political uncertainty, more need for strategic support right at the center. But again, this didn't translate into clear patterns for the other ministers' offices in non-majority situations.
Okay, so PMO expansion linked to non-majority. What about majority governments?
They tended towards stability in the PMO, keeping the core team fairly steady. But here's a key finding. The vast majority of all contractions in the other ministers' offices, the MOs, happened under majority governments.
So majority governments were the ones most likely to cut advisor numbers outside the PMO.
That's what the data suggests. Perhaps they feel more secure, more able to streamline, maybe trim perceived fat. The authors also hint there might be a link to leadership changes within those majority governments, sometimes triggering cuts.
Fascinating. Okay, final factor. Leadership stability.
Yeah.
Did it matter if the PM changed midterm?
Yes, hugely. They found what they call a stable leader effect. Prime ministers who served their full term without being replaced were much more likely to preside over an increase in the total number of ministerial advisors across the board.
So stability breeds growth in advisory teams.
It seems so, but the flip side was just as stark, a midterm change in prime minister. That didn't just stop growth, it often led to actual contractions, shrinking numbers in both the PMO and the MOs.
So leadership turnover really disrupts things.
Absolutely. It seems to put the brakes on expansion and can even reverse it. It really highlights how much the stability at the very top impacts these staffing resources.
Wow. So looking across all four factors, it's clear the political context is incredibly important. It's not just some inevitable bureaucratic creep.
Precisely. And it shows why looking at these advisor numbers is actually a pretty useful lens. It gives us a concrete measure to see how resources shift depending on whether a government is left or right, new or old, secure in parliament or not, and has stable leadership or not.
Yeah, some of those findings, like the slight right bias or the non-majority PM growth, really make you think differently about how these governments operate day to day.
Definitely provides valuable insights.
Okay, so let's try and sum up the main contributions of this research by Pickering, Kraft, and Brands that we've dived into. What are the big takeaways?
I'd say two main things. First, they've painstakingly mapped out how these advisory offices have actually changed over 2 decades in these 4 countries. And crucially, they showed it's not just expansion, stability, and contraction are major parts of the story, too.
Right, busting that myth of constant growth.
Exactly. And second, they've started to explain why these changes happen by linking them to those key political factors: party, tenure, parliament, leadership. It gives us a framework for understanding the conditions that favor growth, stability, or cuts.
So the core message is, advisor numbers are a useful clue to executive power, but how they change is really tangled up in the specific political situation.
That's a great way to put it. It's nuanced, it's context-dependent.
Did the article suggest where researchers should go next with this?
Yes, they pointed out a few interesting paths. One is obviously to see if this framework applies outside the Westminster world. Do similar patterns hold in, say, presidential systems or other parliamentary democracies?
Good question.
Another big one is digging into the qualitative side more. What are these advisors actually doing? How does their work translate into real influence for the minister?
Yeah, moving beyond just the numbers.
Right. And maybe looking within the MOs, does the senior minister for finance have a different setup than, say, the minister for culture? And the really big question they float, can we link the size of a minister's team to how effective they actually are? Does having more advisors mean better performance?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Pretty much. Those are all really important next steps to build on this quantitative baseline they've established.
It certainly takes the conversation about government resources to a more sophisticated level.
It does. And maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Think about the governments you watch or read about. How might these findings, this ebb and flow of advisor numbers, connect what those governments achieve or don't achieve?
Yeah, does a PM struggling in a minority situation with an expanding office seem more effective or just more bogged down?
Right. Or does a majority government cutting advisor seem leaner and more efficient, or maybe just less equipped? What does this complex dynamic of expansion, stability, and contraction really mean for how well these countries are governed? And what might it signal about the future of leadership?
Definitely something to chew on. It shows there's a lot more going on beneath the surface of political power than we often assume.